Hey, nice to have you all. I recognize some faces there. That's a beautiful thing. So thanks for being with us. And yeah, I find this topic today a little bit, it's a little bit heavy in a couple of spots in terms of the science, but follow with me and I'll try and explain as best as I can. I think it comes to a really interesting conclusion that I think is very, very thought-provoking. So really nice to have you here. I hope that your day is going well, wherever you might be in the world. But let's kick it off. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but I don't know if this is showing my age thing or what, but are you basically give me a thumbs up or reaction if you know this song. There's a hole in my buckets. All right, we've got some hands going up. Do they still teach this in schools? Man, you might be able to. No, they don't. They've done away with a hole in the bucket. So you remember the song? I'm not going to sing it because you don't want to hear me singing it. But basically, it's this sort of recurring thing where there's a hole in the bucket, and he says, "Dear Liza," I think, yeah, Liza, and she says, "Well, go fix it, Henry." And he's like, "Yeah, okay, but the problem is I've got this," and she says, "We'll do that," and he can't do that. And eventually it becomes this circular thing where he actually can't fix this bucket because he can't get the straw and cut the straw, and because he doesn't have a knife that's sharp, and to sharpen the knife he needs the stone, but the stone's not wet, and therefore he'd need water to do it, and therefore he needs to fetch some water, but he can't fetch the water. So it's this recurring thing, and it drives you nuts if you keep going around in that circles too many times. But what it makes me think of is this whole idea of stepping back one level, like, oh, why that? And in fact, one of the who was the founder of the Toyota Corporation, Sakichi Toyota, he actually came up with this idea of these, what is called 5 whys. And that is, if you want to get to the root cause of a particular thing, what you need to do is ask the whys. Right? And kids are really good at asking whys. I have these vivid memories of my kids asking why to the most random questions when they're little tackers. But it's how we understand. It's how we can get to the root cause and understand what's actually going on there. Now, in the health world, the people who ask the whys are referred to as epidemiologists. And essentially what an epidemiologist does, just in case you're thinking about becoming one, is they ask the question, or what's the cause of that? Or what's the cause of that? In other words, why? And if you step back far enough, you can get back to the root cause of the problem. And what's really fascinating is the epidemiological literature suggests that if we look at the poor health of people and the poor health of the planet, seems to be a common root cause. And this is what I'd love to step back with you through today. So we're going to start by looking at people first. So we know today that many people are experiencing ill health, right? And the most prevalent thing that we're encountering are these chronic conditions. So things like heart disease, diabetes, certain cancers, a whole host of these chronic conditions, and we would refer to them as, I suppose you'd call them sort of biological problems, biological pathologies. But an epidemiologist go, okay, so we've got all these problems. What's the cause of that? And I would love for you can just sort of get involved here. I know I can't hear you, but at least I feel like you're with me. So I would love for you to now just ask the question, and if you've got people around, just mutter it under your breath, but you'd say, well, what's the cause of that? I'm assuming you did that. All right, so the cause of that is these things, what we call risk factors. And so what we know is there are certain things that if you have these, you're more inclined to develop these biological problems, these chronic conditions. And some of the risk factors, one sort of the big overarching thing we talk about now is these inflammatory processes. And sometimes it's referred to as metaflammation because it's linked to metabolism and inflammatory processes there. But there are other risk factors as well. For example, we know that obesity is a risk factor for chronic diseases, particularly if you have sort of carrying extra weight in your sort of central area. Things like insulin resistance, you would have heard of this, and high cholesterol and high blood pressure. These are risk factors for the progression of these biological problems. But, okay, we've got these risk factors. A good epidemiologist would ask the question, I'm assuming, I saw Mandy move sort of a little bit, so I'm assuming she's playing along. What's the cause of that? Well, if we step back, we actually know that the cause of this thing like inflammation and obesity and that are things like overnutrition, we're eating too much, underactivity, we're not moving enough, stress, these are all factors that then contribute to this inflammatory processes and obesity and these risk factors, and then they can progress onto these disease states. However, a good epidemiologist, which you're becoming rapidly, good epidemiologist would ask the question, what's the cause of that? And I'm glad you asked, because what we know is the actual root cause of these sort of proximal causes, overnutrition, inactivity, stress, and all the rest of it, is actually the modern lifestyle. We know that the reason we tend to eat too much is because we can. We've got really clever at being able to produce food en masse, right? And it's not ideally, when I say food, it's often food-like substances, but nonetheless, we have a lot of it. And we're so clever with our modern lifestyle that we were able to create machines that do the work for us. So I don't have to wash my hands, my washing by hand. I can just throw it in a machine, or my dishes, or I can hop in a car that takes me places. I don't need to use my legs. And so if you step back, what epidemiologists know is the root cause of a lot of the problems, the downstream problems that confront us in terms of our health outcomes, is actually a modern lifestyle. But a good epidemiologist would ask, well, what's the cause of that, this modern lifestyle? And there's really good consensus here that the root cause is actually economic growth. So we have this idea, we grow, we're clever, so we want to spark industry. And so people get smart at being able to manufacture food in new ways. They get smart at producing devices that are labor saving. They get smart at doing these things. So economic growth, that whole, bigger, let's grow, actually downstream drives our own smartness, almost comes back to bite us. And so when we look at what's the root cause of the poor health of people, you can actually stem it back to economic growth. And what's really fascinating, in times of economic downturn, you can actually see improvements in a lot of those sort of biological problems that people suffer from. We know, for example, during the Great Depression, you actually saw reductions in things like heart disease and many of these chronic conditions, right? So it's really this fascinating link. That's people. What about the planet? We know that we're actually, and I hope that I don't need to go through and demonstrate the evidence here, but there's definitely this sort of ecological problems going on. So while we've got biological pathologies or problems in us humans, we've got ecological problems and pathologies happening within the planet. And this manifests as things like natural disasters. We're seeing all the fires and the earthquakes and tsunamis and all the rest of it. There's an escalation in the amount of these events. An epidemiologist would ask the question, what's the cause of that? Well, if you step back, what's interesting, it's these risk factors that actually set the planet up for potentially having all these ecological pathologies. And what are those risk factors? Well, collectively, we actually call it's almost like the system, the planetary system is inflamed. Just like inside us humans, we get this metaflammation. It's like an ecoflammation that takes place within the system. And it's characterized by things like, carbon resistance, global warming, climate change, CO2 levels, all of these risk factors for disease. But a good epidemiologist would ask, well, what's the cause of that? And what we actually know is the cause of these things are things like overproduction. So now we have a lot of waste. We get then pollution that goes alongside with that. We have the resources, the natural resources, there's stress to accommodate and cope. And so what you can see, I hope you see this unfolding in just the same way that within the humans, we actually have this, you can ask what's the cause of that? What's the cause of that? What are the 5 whys? You actually come back to, this spot. Well, we see a similar manifestation when we talk about the planet. A good epidemiologist would ask, what's the cause of overproduction, of waste, of pollution, of this resource stress? And it turns out it's actually the modern lifestyle once again, which, as I've already indicated, is related to economic growth. So here's this really interesting little, and I'm borrowing a lot off actually a dear friend and colleague and mentor of mine, Professor Gary Egger, who did a lot of work in this space in understanding this connection. He's an epidemiologist himself. We know that the root cause, if you want to get back to it, of the poor health of people and the planet can actually come back to this economic growth, right? So I remember hearing this presentation. Actually, it was Gary Egger, Professor Egger, who was presenting this one time. And I was sitting next to Dr. John Kelly, who was the founding president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. He's a great guy, a friend of mine. And he said to me, he said, I've got one more question. And I said, oh yeah. And he said, my question is, what's the cause of that? And that was, what is the cause of economic growth? What drives this? And you know what it is? It's something about us humans, right? Something about us humans wants bigger. We want better. We want more, right? And why is that? You know, what is it that drives that? In fact, this was a book that was written a few years back now, but it's the name of the book was Affluenza, Clive Hamilton and Richard Dennis. And they define this thing that we humans seem to suffer from, right? And this is how they defined it. It's affluenza. It's a painful, contagious, socially transmitted condition of overload, debt, anxiety, and waste resulting from, here it is, the dogged pursuit of more. The dogged pursuit of more. And when I look at that, I go, I think I know what they're talking about there. You know, when you see a house like this, what do you think? You know, when all the houses in the street were like that little white one, things were fine. But when all of a sudden that got torn down and the one went up beside it, now the grey one, what do you think the people in the white house that were previously pretty content there, what are they now thinking? I want a house like that one, right? All of a sudden it's socially transmitted. And what it does is actually really plays into this confusion that we have between standard of living and quality of life. We often think that if our standard of living is improved, that our quality of life would be all the better. And there's actually, that's not the case. You know, it can be the case, but it's often not. In fact, you know, there's a lot of evidence that people who have relatively little, you can go to countries where people have relatively little, and their standard of living by our standards would be considered to be very poor, yet their quality of life is very rich. You know, they report high levels of happiness, high levels of well-being, high levels of flourishing, satisfaction with life. And so there's this confusion that we often have. And look, you know, I'm not pointing the finger at anyone except me in this regard. Like, I have too much stuff. I know I do. I've actually got too much sporting equipment. My wife is so tolerant. I've got like 2 hang gliders. Actually, I might even have 3. There's one in the bench there. And why do I have this stuff? Well, it's because I think, oh, if I had that, then I could use it then. But do you know what I've actually come to learn is that when you have more stuff, sometimes it actually detracts from your quality of life. It's actually doesn't become a wing to you anymore. It actually becomes a weight to you. And you know, and this can manifest in quite a simple way. I can go down to the beach with my wing foiling set up, and I've got several different foils I can use. And I sit there angsting about which one I should take out now. What are the conditions? Oh, what about if it changes? Whereas if I had one, I'd be as happy as Larry. I'd put it on, I'd go out, and I'd have a great time. And so I've actually learned that, you know, it's not a bad exercise to go, what are the things that I have in my life, right? And are they a weight to me or are they a wing to me? And maybe the weights we need to rethink. Maybe we need to think more about, you know, how much is enough? How much do we need? It can be a really valuable exercise to do that. So I'm going to hand it back to Mandy, and we've got some reflection questions for you to chat about.